Okay, I want to talk now about. I'm kind of give you the big picture of philosophy. I want to talk about the history of philosophy. So when we read different people in the book, you can kind of place them historically. When you read Plato, it's nice to know kind of like when did Plato live, and you should know that when you read Plato that he didn't live in the 1800s or 1700s. And when you read David Hume, you should know that he's not in the 20th century. He's not in the Middle Ages. So I want to go over some just the basic stuff. The history of philosophy can be broken into three periods. Philosophy, ancient philosophy, medieval, and modern philosophy. Okay, so that's the three divisions. So every philosopher you read will be in one of these periods. Ancient philosophy goes from around 600 BC, or BCE they say nowadays, before the Common Era, to around, let's say around 400 AD or CE, Common Era. Okay? These are just, they're not exact dates. I mean, there's no exact dates, but approximately. Medieval philosophy goes from around 400 or maybe a little before to, let's say, 14, I don't know, 50, let's say, basically to the Renaissance. And then modern philosophy begins with Descartes. It begins with Descartes, and Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. So 1600, around modern philosophy begins around 1600 to the present. So I'll make this 1600 here. There's like a little transition between medieval and modern. The Renaissance is in here, but these are the three main divisions: ancient, medieval, modern. The first philosopher is Thales. Let me just erase. I'm going to erase this now. Ancient, medieval, modern. Okay, then the ancient philosopher, the first one that we know of is Thales. He's the first philosopher. He's the first person that anybody knows of who decided his main goal was to understand nature, to understand what the world was made out of, where everything came from. So and so he was concerned mainly with what we would call science. But let me say something about the word science and philosophy. When we talk about philosophy up until around 1800, we're not talking about anything that's not science. They were the same thing. I mean, that's so the word science did not even exist until around 1830. So Isaac Newton, we talk of Isaac Newton as a scientist. Isaac Newton would not have known what you were talking about because the word did not even exist in his time. Isaac Newton was a natural philosopher. Okay, that's why nowadays when people get they get a PhD in physics, chemistry, biology. Well, what does a PhD mean? It means a doctor of philosophy. Why would you call somebody who gets the highest degree in physics or chemistry a doctor of philosophy? Why not a doctor of physics, a doctor of biology? The reason is because the word philosophy is being used in the traditional sense of natural philosophy. So Aristotle was a philosopher, a great philosopher, but also a scientist. I mean, he was the greatest biologist up until Darwin. He was a philosopher, so there's no difference between philosophy and science. So Thales is not only the beginning of philosophy, but he's the beginning of science. He was the first person to ask the question, what is everything made out of? And he was going to answer it not by appealing to tradition or to religion or mythology or any sacred book, but just using his reason and perception, sense perception. So Thales is the first philosopher or the first scientist. Up until Thales and many other philosophers came, but eventually we get to Socrates. And Socrates was born in like 370, and he died in 299. Okay, that's when you read the Apology, that's when he drank the hemlock, the poison hemlock. So all the philosophers that come between, let's say, from 600 BCE to 370, around 350, whatever. These were called pre-Socratic. So you got because they came from before Socrates. So the pre-Socratic philosophers. So ancient philosophy is basically it can be broken into the pre-Socratics, and then you have the period after Socrates. The big difference between Socrates and the pre-Socratics is that Socrates was not interested in any of these questions that they were asking. They were asking questions about what is nature made out of? What are the things it's made out of? How far are the stars? What are the stars made out of? Socrates was not interested in those type of questions. He was interested in ethical questions. What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? And Socrates said, why do I care what the sun is made out of? Why do I care how far the sun is from the earth? Why do I care what everything is? Is everything water? Is everything air? Why do I care? Is it going to make me a better person? And Socrates said, no, it's not going to make me a better person. I don't care. Socrates is interested in ethical questions, and he's really the founder of ethics. And then after Socrates, it becomes a very important subject. Plato, Aristotle, they're all concerned with ethics. Cicero said that Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens. He brought it down to earth because he became interested in human problems. What does it mean to live a good life? Socrates had a disciple, Plato, and then Plato had a student, Aristotle. So these are the three big names of ancient philosophy: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. When you think of ancient philosophy, in most universities around the world, or when you study ancient philosophy, pretty much you devote yourself to studying Plato and Aristotle. And you're also studying Socrates at the same time. I should say something about Socrates, because Socrates never wrote a word. So you're never gonna open up a book by Socrates. What you're going to do is you're going to open up a book by Plato, and in Plato's dialogues, Plato never speaks in his own name. He always speaks in the name of Socrates. So because Plato wrote dialogues. So when you read his dialogues, you're going to have Socrates in most of his dialogues, not all of them, but just about every one. He's the main character. And Plato is using Socrates as his mouthpiece to express his own ideas. The early Platonic dialogues, most scholars believe, give you a very good sense of the historical Socrates. As you move into the later dialogues, it's maybe not so much historical Socrates. Anyway, and then after Aristotle, you get different schools in ancient philosophy. You get the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Cynics and so on. They're important too, but they're not normally you don't study those people in universities. You mainly the focus on Plato and Aristotle. So that's ancient philosophy. You get the pre-Socratics, and then you come down Thales, and some of the other big names were Pythagoras. You all know him from the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras believed that ultimate reality was mathematical, were numbers and geometrical figures. And then you had Heraclitus is another big figure in ancient philosophy. Heraclitus believed that everything was changing, everything is constant changing. And then you had Parmenides, another great ancient philosopher. And Parmenides and Heraclitus were very different. They were opposites. Heraclitus believed everything is changing. Parmenides believed that there was no change. Change was an illusion. Okay? So we'll talk about these more when we talk about Plato, because for Plato was influenced by both of them. He was influenced by Heraclitus, and he was influenced by Parmenides. Plato believed that they were both right, but they were also both wrong. So what he did is he synthesized them and created a new philosophy out of them. And then, so Plato will react against Parmenides and Heraclitus, and then Aristotle is going to come on the scene. He's going to react against Plato, and that's basically how the history of philosophy works. You get one philosopher says one thing, and then another philosopher is going to come around, and critique it, and so that's how philosophy proceeds, basically through conflict. So that's ancient philosophy. I got a few minutes. Let me briefly just go over this. So medieval philosophy goes from basically medieval from like 400 to like say 1600. The two big figures here. The main thing about medieval philosophy is that it is dominated by Christianity. Ancient philosophy is dominated by the Greeks, by the Greek philosophy. Medieval philosophy is dominated by Christianity. So all the philosophers here, because Christianity became dominant in this period, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity became dominant. All the philosophers are Christians, they're Catholics, Roman Catholics. The great philosophers here are St. Augustine, around 400, and to Thomas Aquinas in the 14th century. And then after Aquinas, you still have medieval philosophy, but it's breaking up. So Augustine and Aquinas are the two big figures in medieval philosophy. After Plato, they are the two greatest geniuses ever to arise in Europe. Aquinas. So basically, Aquinas is very important because Aquinas will reconcile, at least attempt to reconcile Christianity with Aristotle, whereas Augustine is a Platonist. Augustine is seeing Christianity through the eyes of Plato. So that's medieval philosophy. The main concern here is how to reconcile faith and reason. So that's the big thing. Faith in Christianity and reason. That's the dominant concern, to reconcile faith and reason. That was not a concern of the Greeks because Christianity did not exist. Okay, and then now we go to modern philosophy. And you read a little about this in the chapter, in the introduction to Introducing Philosophy. Modern philosophy begins with Descartes. Modern philosophy begins around 1600. So Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. And Descartes is in rebellion against medieval philosophy. He's in rebellion against Aristotle. So basically what Descartes does is he's looking for certainty. This is the main thing about modern philosophy, is it has to deal with science. This is when science is coming on the scene. So modern philosophy has to deal with science. Medieval philosophy had to deal with Christianity, and the Greeks didn't have to deal with either one of those. They just had to deal basically with basically for Thales, he had to go against Homer, tradition, and so on. They had to set up the primacy of reason. In modern philosophy, the science develops in consort with science. And Descartes' great task was to provide a foundation for science. He actually believed that he could provide a foundation for science. Why? How? By establishing something that you could know with absolute certainty. With Descartes, what happens is that the primary concern of philosophy now becomes epistemology, knowledge. How can we know something with certainty? That's Descartes' main concern. So that's modern philosophy. And then if you want to, think of like what's going on in the contemporary world, that's called contemporary philosophy. Contemporary philosophy really begins, I'd say, around 1900. So contemporary philosophy, it's all part of modern philosophy, but it's a subset of it. So it really begins around 1900. And the big names there are Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, Frege, people like that. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for today. So I'll see you next time. So that's two more.